In the autumn of 1821, in a remote village near the Austrian-Italian border, a 10-year-old boy named Matthias is discovered wandering the woods, weak and delirious. He is taken in by a local schoolmaster, Herr Kraus, who quickly realizes that Matthias does not speak German, Italian or Latin, nor any tongue known to scholars. The boy's words, though unintelligible, carried the weight of centuries. Each syllable seemed carved from stone, hollow yet resonant, and when he spoke the firelight flickered as if the air itself recoiled. Kraus listened, his rational mind warring with the tightening in his chest. He tried the languages of his trade, Greek, scraps of Hebrew, but Matthias stared at him with unblinking eyes, murmuring in tones that felt both alien and achingly familiar. Villagers gathered at the schoolhouse window, their breath clouding the glass, whispering of devils and lost tribes. But Kraus, though shaken, sensed something deeper. This was no madness, no invention. It was remembrance, echoing from a place the world had long buried. The days that followed wrapped the village in a fog of unease. Matthias, though frail in body, grew more insistent in his speech. His voice carried a rhythm that unsettled even the strongest men, as if each sound pressed against the fabric of memory. Herr Kraus, determined to approach the matter with reason, recorded what he could. He filled slate after slate with crooked symbols, each stroke an attempt to capture the alien cadences tumbling from the boy's lips. But the more he wrote, the more his notes seemed to resist him. Letters warped, shifted, curved into shapes that he had not drawn. Once he swore he caught the symbols moving faintly when the candle guttered low, as if the very act of capturing Matthias's language on paper was forbidden. Kraus was not alone in his confusion. Priests from the chapel came to listen, their brows furrowed, their hands clutching crucifixes tight against their chests. Father Weber, the eldest among them, muttered of possession and the tongues of fallen angels. But others noticed fragments, sounds that resembled the broken remnants of inscriptions carved into the standing stones beyond the hills, relics left by tribes long forgotten. An old shepherd swore the boy's chant mirrored the words etched into a crumbling slab he had once seen deep in the forest, a slab no man could read, but which had always filled him with unease. The villagers grew restless. Mothers drew their children away when Matthias passed. Men muttered that his presence brought the frost early, that their animals stirred at night in terror. Even the dogs refused to linger near the schoolhouse, their ears pinned, their bodies trembling when the boy's voice rose. By the second week, rumors swelled into fever. Some claimed the boy was not lost at all, but sent, a messenger from some ancient race, or worse, a mouth through which the dead themselves might speak. Kraus, caught between duty and fear, sent letters to Vienna. He begged for the aid of scholars who might untangle the riddle, though even as he wrote, he doubted whether science alone could offer an answer. Still, he clung to rationality as a drowning man clings to driftwood. He told himself the boy was a curiosity, an accident of nature, a child raised in isolation who had invented his own tongue. Yet at night, when Matthias's voice climbed to strange, lilting chants, Kraus would wake drenched in sweat, haunted by the certainty that what he heard was no invention at all. It was memory given flesh. One evening, as a storm broke over the valley, Matthias rose from his cot and pressed his palm against the frost-flecked window. He whispered in his language, his breath fogging the glass, and for an instant Kraus thought he saw not his own reflection, but an older face gazing back from the pane, lined, solemn, and crowned with symbols cut deep into the skin. The boy turned then, his eyes empty of childhood, and spoke a phrase so sharp, so heavy, that Kraus dropped his lantern. As the flames sputtered out, the schoolmaster realized with horror that though he could not understand the meaning, he had recognized the rhythm. It was a funeral dirge, one sung in the valley long before the church had raised its spire. Word of the strange boy spread beyond the valley, carried on the tongues of traders who crossed the mountain passes. By the third week, strangers began to arrive, a gaunt antiquarian from Milan, a pair of young priests from Salzburg, and finally a linguist dispatched from Vienna, a man named Franz Bauer. Tall, severe, with ink-stained fingers and a restless gaze, Bauer had built his career on reconstructing fragments of lost languages. Yet when he first heard Matthias speak, he paled as though struck. "These syllables," he murmured. "They should not be." Bauer spent hours listening, scribbling frantically in his notebooks. He recognized shards of Etruscan, tones of Ligurian, echoes of ancient Greek, yet all fused into something older than any record, a tongue like a skeleton pieced together from the bones of civilizations. What disturbed him most was its coherence. This was no random babble. The boy spoke with grammar, with rhythm, with intent. Sometimes he argued with himself, sometimes he pleaded, and sometimes he chanted in long, rising cadences that left Bauer trembling. It was as though Matthias carried within him the memory of tongues that had long ago sunk into the earth. The villagers, however, saw no science in it. When Matthias spoke, their cattle stampeded in the night. Infants wailed without ceasing, crops blackened under an early frost that none could explain. Fear fermented into fury. They pressed Kraus to cast the boy out, to deliver him to the priests, or failing that, to the forest from which he came. "This is no child," they hissed in the tavern. "This is an omen, a mouth for the old gods, demanding we remember what should stay buried." Kraus resisted, torn between his duty as guardian and the terror curling in his gut. He saw Matthias shiver like any orphan, hungry and frail, but he also could not forget the night he glimpsed that ancient face, reflected in the window. He hoped Bauer might anchor him, yet even Bauer's confidence wavered. In private, the scholar confessed, "I thought I studied dead languages, Herr Kraus, but this one, it studies me. It seems to know I am listening." One night, Bauer attempted an experiment. "The boy does not learn from me. I learn from him, and I fear what I am becoming fluent in." The winter of 1821 came early, spilling down from the mountains like a gravecloth. Snow sealed the roofs, and the wind clawed through the chimneys with voices that sounded too much like Matthias's chants. Inside the schoolhouse, firelight barely pushed back the gloom. Bauer remained there constantly, ink-stained, hollow-eyed, as if bound to the boy by invisible cords. Kraus tried to maintain some semblance of order, but the villagers' trust in him frayed with every passing day. Matthias still drew breath. One evening, as the bells tolled Compline, Bauer insisted on recording an entire night of the boy's speech. He set his notebooks open, candles lit, and coaxed Matthias into speaking freely. What began as murmurs became a torrent, sentences rising like waves, rhythm sharp as a drumbeat. The sound grew so dense that Kraus, though he did not understand a single word, felt the shape of meaning pressing against his skull. Images bled into his mind, torches burning on stone altars, rivers running red, faces carved in rock with hollow eyes that watched across centuries. The air thickened. Candles flared tall, their flames bending toward Matthias as though drawn by a draught only he could command. The boy's frail body shook, but his voice never faltered, climbing higher until the sound resembled both prayer and curse. Bauer scribbled furiously, but his hand no longer seemed his own. He wrote characters he had never seen, not from Matthias's lips, but from somewhere deeper, older. When at last he looked at the page, the ink had coiled into spirals that seemed to burrow into the paper, forms that made his vision blur. He tore the page free and cast it into the fire. The parchment curled, blackened, and screamed as though flesh burned instead of paper. The villagers, drawn by the unnatural light in the windows, gathered outside. They heard Matthias's chant and fled, leaving only Father Weber, clutching his crucifix so tightly his knuckles bled. He burst inside, shouting for silence, and flung holy water at the boy. The drops sizzled as if cast onto iron. Matthias stopped mid-sentence and turned to the priest with an expression of infinite patience, like a teacher watching a stubborn child. Then slowly he spoke 3 words. None understood them, but Father Weber staggered back, gasping, clutching his chest. The crucifix snapped in 2, falling to the floor with a hollow clang. Moments later, the old priest lay motionless, eyes wide with terror, breath gone. In the silence that followed, Matthias lowered his gaze, as if the act had cost him nothing. Bauer trembled, torn between awe and horror. Kraus fell to his knees beside the priest, whispering prayers he had not spoken since his own childhood. Matthias simply returned to the window, pressing his hand to the frost, his lips moving softly again. And though the words were low, Kraus understood what they meant. Not their syllables, but their weight. The boy was not speaking to them. He was calling something else. The death of Father Weber split the village like a wound. By dawn, the bells tolled not for prayer, but for fear. Some claimed the priest's heart had failed. Others whispered the boy had killed him with words no Christian tongue could counter. Rumors swelled into frenzy. Mothers clutched their infants close, men sharpened their tools into weapons, and old women muttered that the mountains themselves had sent Matthias as punishment for forgetting the old ways. Herr Kraus fought to hold order, though his own faith crumbled. He buried Weber in frozen soil, while Matthias stood at the edge of the grave, murmuring. The chant was low, like a lullaby, yet the air carried a pressure that pressed against every chest. Even the gravediggers wept, as though mourning not a priest, but something greater, something older. When the last shovel of earth was thrown, a fissure cracked across the frozen mound, steaming faintly in the cold. None dared approach. Inside the schoolhouse, Bauer grew consumed. He studied Matthias without rest, his notebooks now filled with symbols that no longer resembled any known alphabet. The characters spiraled, nested, folded back into themselves, and when Kraus glanced at them, he felt as if he was staring into a mirror too deep to escape. Bauer claimed progress, muttering that he had begun to understand the bones of the language. But at night, Kraus heard him speak in his sleep, his voice echoing the boy's cadence. The villagers reached a breaking point. One night, torches in hand, they gathered outside the schoolhouse, demanding Kraus deliver the boy. Their voices rose. "He is a plague, a curse, a demon clothed in child's flesh." Kraus stood firm at the door, heart hammering, shielding Matthias and Bauer behind him. "He is a child," he shouted, though his voice cracked, "and you will not harm him." Yet when Matthias stepped into view, silent for Bauer, once the mob fell to a hush, his gaze swept across them, not defiant, not pleading, but knowing. Several dropped their torches, backing away as though their courage had been stolen in a single glance. That night, as the mob dispersed, Kraus pressed Bauer to act. "This must end. You see what is happening. The people will not wait much longer." Bauer only smiled faintly, exhaustion hollowing his face. "End? My friend, we stand at the beginning. The boy is a doorway. Through him the past returns. Through him the forgotten speaks." His eyes gleamed feverishly in the candlelight. "And I intend to listen, no matter the cost." Kraus recoiled. For the first time, he realized Bauer no longer saw Matthias as a child. He saw him as scripture. The storm that followed raged for 3 nights without pause. Snow fell so heavily that the roads vanished, sealing the village like a tomb. No one could leave, and none from outside could reach them. The isolation gnawed at the people, and with it came the creeping sense that Matthias's presence had brought the storm itself. Within the schoolhouse, Kraus kept vigil by the fire, though his hands trembled from lack of sleep. Bauer, meanwhile, had surrendered to obsession. His voice now echoed Matthias's at times, repeating phrases under his breath, rolling the syllables like stones in his mouth. One evening, Kraus awoke to the sound of 2 voices chanting. Rising unsteadily, he saw Matthias seated cross-legged on the floor, his small hands tracing patterns in the soot. Opposite him sat Bauer, eyes shut, lips moving in perfect unison with the boy's. The words were not imitation, but harmony, call and response, as though the scholar had become priest to the child's god. Kraus cried out, breaking the trance, and Bauer opened his eyes, eyes that seemed too dark, pupils drowned in shadow. "He teaches me," Bauer whispered. "He shows me the roots beneath our tongues. Every word we speak is a fragment of him." That night, Bauer confessed something more. In the silence between chants, he claimed he had begun to dream in Matthias's language. At first, broken phrases, then whole sentences, then entire visions, temples carved into cliffs, seas boiling beneath black suns, voices echoing across the earth long before the first cross was raised. His voice shook, not with fear but with reverence. "It is not memory, Herr Kraus. It is inheritance. We carry their ashes in our marrow, and the boy stirs them awake." The next day, villagers reported strange happenings. A woman tending her goats claimed she heard Matthias's voice carried on the wind, though he had never left the schoolhouse. "See." A child spoke a phrase in play that none understood, yet her mother swore she had heard Matthias utter it the day before. Shadows in the snow grew long even when the sun was high, bending like arms. The villagers prayed louder, but their prayers felt hollow against the whispers that now threaded their dreams. Kraus began to fear not only for the boy, but for the very fabric of the village. Bauer was no longer the only one infected. Matthias's language was seeping outward, sinking into the cracks of their minds. Even Kraus, who clung to reason, caught himself mouthing fragments in his sleep, the sounds sour and bitter on his tongue. He woke with the taste of earth and blood at the back of his throat. When he confronted Matthias, demanding to know what he wanted, the boy only tilted his head and spoke a phrase so soft it felt like breath against the ear. Kraus did not understand the words, but he felt the meaning strike his chest. "We are not alone." By the 7th week of Matthias's arrival, the village no longer dreamed in peace. Men woke screaming, unable to recall what they had seen, only the echo of a voice drilling into their skulls. Women clutched their children tighter, whispering that their little ones had begun muttering in sleep, their lips shaping sounds no parent had taught them. Even animals bore the mark of unease. Horses reared at invisible threats, dogs howled through the night, and the cattle refused to drink from the stream, which had turned dark with a strange mineral sheen. Kraus, desperate to halt the unraveling, begged Bauer to end his experiments. But the scholar was beyond reason. His notebooks multiplied, scrawled in symbols Kraus could not decipher, filled with diagrams of constellations and skeletal alphabets that seemed to twist into faces when stared at too long. When Kraus tried to burn one of them, Bauer nearly struck him, snarling that he would not silence the voice of the first tongue. His obsession had hollowed him out, cheeks sunken, skin feverish, eyes alight with a devotion that was no longer human curiosity, but worship. Then came the first true sign of contagion. A child from the village, 7 years old, collapsed in the square. When lifted by his mother, he spoke not her name but a phrase in Matthias's language. His voice deepened as though borrowed from a throat. For return, the village slipped into a fever of dread. Each morning the church bell tolled, not to summon worship, but to remind the living they had survived another night. The new priest, young and trembling, urged the people to fast, to pray, to resist the devil's tongue. Yet even in his sermons, stray syllables of Matthias's language slid into his speech, unnoticed by him but chilling to those who listened. Mothers wept as their children echoed those same syllables in play, their small voices shaping the impossible with ease, as though they had been born knowing. Kraus wandered the streets, hollow-eyed, trying to calm the people, but his words rang empty. They no longer trusted him. To them, he was the keeper of the curse, the man who had sheltered Matthias. Some spat as he passed, others crossed themselves. By night, he returned to the schoolhouse, where Bauer sat hunched over his papers, the boy across from him like a dark mirror. The two would speak for hours in that strange cadence, voices rising and falling as if in ancient debate. Kraus listened once, only once, and fled outside, retching. He could not explain it. The words had brushed his bones, leaving them trembling like struck glass. And then came the night of the fire. One of the villagers, drunk with fear, hurled a torch against the schoolhouse wall. Flames licked the timber, but as Kraus rushed to smother them, a roar shook the ground. A sound not of fire, but of voices, dozens, hundreds, all layered through Matthias's small throat. The flames recoiled, twisting back into smoke, leaving the wood unscathed. The mob scattered in terror, but not before hearing one final phrase thunder from the boy's lips, a phrase so loud it rattled windows across the valley. None understood the words, yet all knew the meaning. A warning. The next day, silence hung heavy. No villager dared approach the schoolhouse again, the village, its square emptied, doors barred, shutters sealed. Even the air felt thinner, as though the valley itself were holding its breath. Kraus prayed for clarity but found none. Bauer, however, seemed transformed. His voice carried Matthias's cadences now, and sometimes when Kraus caught his eye, he swore it was the boy gazing back at him. That evening, Bauer confessed what Kraus had most feared. "It is not possession, Herr Kraus. It is communion. He is not a vessel for something greater. He is the greater. And soon, we will all remember who we were." By the turn of January, the village could bear no more. Crops spoiled beneath the snow, goats birthed stillborn kids, and the river froze solid overnight, though the air was not cold enough. In every house, whispers of Matthias's tongue drifted through dreams, binding the people tighter to his shadow. Fear fermented into resolve. The council of elders gathered in the tavern, the air thick with smoke and desperation, and decided what none dared speak aloud until then. The boy must die. They planned it for a night without moon. Men chosen for their strength armed themselves with axes and iron hooks, relics said to ward off spirits. The priest blessed them, though his own voice cracked into Matthias's cadence mid-prayer, and he fell weeping to his knees. Still, the men swore they would end it, burn the boy, scatter his ashes into the river, and seal the valley with silence. Word spread in whispers. Mothers hushed their children, doors locked early, eyes averted as though the mountains themselves might overhear. But Kraus overheard too. A neighbor, drunk on courage, spat the truth in his face. "Your boy will be gone before dawn." Shaken, he rushed back to the schoolhouse, where he found Bauer hunched over Matthias, both of them chanting softly. Kraus burst in, begging, "They mean to kill him. We must flee. Tonight." Bauer lifted his head slowly. His face bore a calm that chilled Kraus more than any storm. "They cannot kill him. Do you not see? He is not bound by their world, their time. Their axes will strike air, their flames will only serve him." Matthias turned then, eyes gleaming like frost under starlight, and spoke a single phrase that made Bauer shudder in awe. Kraus staggered back, torn between terror and pity. "He is a child," he cried, voice breaking. But even as the words left him, he no longer believed them. Matthias's gaze was not that of a boy. It was Tor's, the gaze of something older, something waiting. That night, as the mob gathered their torches, a storm rose sudden and fierce. Snow whipped across the valley, smothering sound, and in its heart came the echo of many voices. Not just Matthias, but a chorus, as though the mountains themselves had begun to chant. Those who heard dropped their weapons, clutching their ears, blood seeping between their fingers. And still the chanting grew louder. The mob pressed forward through the storm, torches sputtering, their boots sinking deep into the drifts. Snow blinded their eyes, yet Matthias's voice guided them, low, steady, threading the wind like a beacon. They reached the schoolhouse door and battered it down, splinters scattering across the floor. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a thin light over Matthias standing calmly at the center, Bauer beside him, eyes alight with reverence. Kraus stood in the corner, shaking, torn between loyalty and horror. The first villager swung an axe. It cleaved through the air, missing the boy by inches, but the force of the strike sent sparks flaring from the hearth. Matthias did not flinch. Instead, he raised one small hand and spoke. The syllables crashed against the men like waves against rock. Several stumbled back, ears ringing, torches falling. Another swung again, but before the blade reached its mark, the iron blackened, twisted, and snapped in two. The man cried out as the broken haft split his palm. Then, the chanting began in earnest. Matthias's voice rose, but not alone. From every corner of the schoolhouse, from the cracks in the floorboards and the beams overhead, echoes joined in, 1,000 throats where there should have been none. The air thickened, vibrating, pressing against lungs until men gasped for breath. Shadows twisted on the walls, forming shapes too tall, too bent, too ancient to be cast by firelight. The mob broke. Some fled screaming into the snow, others fell to their knees, babbling prayers that crumbled into Matthias's language halfway through. One man, driven to madness, struck at his own chest with the broken axe head, carving symbols into his flesh as though compelled by unseen hands. Bauer fell prostrate at Matthias's feet, tears streaming, whispering, "He returns, he returns." Kraus, trembling, clutched the doorframe to keep from collapsing. His mind screamed to deny it, but his bones knew the truth. The boy was no vessel of demons, no cursed orphan. He was a memory made flesh, a mouth through which the ancient dead remembered themselves. The language was not invention, it was resurrection. Matthias lowered his hand. The storm outside ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Silence pressed in, broken only by the crackle of fire. Those who remained alive and sane cowered, unable to meet his eyes. He spoke one final phrase, slow and deliberate, and though Kraus could not translate it, he felt the meaning coil around his heart. This is only the beginning. By dawn, the village was a graveyard of whispers. Those who survived the night stumbled home half-blind, ears bleeding, tongues trembling with words they could not stop repeating. Others never returned at all, swallowed by the storm or by madness. In the square, the priest tried to ring the church bell, but his hands shook so violently the rope slipped free, and he collapsed sobbing, muttering prayers that dissolved into Matthias's cadence before the final amen. Inside the schoolhouse, Kraus sat hunched, staring at the boy. Matthias had returned to his cot as though nothing had happened, his thin body curled in the blankets, lips moving faintly in sleep. Bauer remained kneeling beside him, head bowed, a fanatic before his idol. When Kraus tried to rouse him, Bauer looked up with eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. "You saw it," he whispered, voice raw. "The language is not sound, it is power. Each word stirs the bones of the earth. He does not speak to us, he speaks through us." Kraus fled outside, desperate for clean air, yet the village offered no refuge. Everywhere he turned, people bore the mark of the night. Children scratched symbols into the snow with their fingers. Old men spoke in murmurs as though rehearsing lines from forgotten rituals. Even the animals behaved strangely, flocks moving in unison, dogs pacing in circles, goats pressing their foreheads into the ground as if bowing to something unseen. That evening, the elders convened once more, their faces gaunt, their eyes rimmed red. They no longer spoke of killing the boy. They spoke instead of escape, abandoning the valley, sealing the passes, leaving the cursed place to rot. But others argued that it was already too late. The language was inside them, carried in their dreams, in their children's mouths. To leave would mean to spread it, like a plague across the world. Their voices rose in panic until, one by one, they fell silent. From the rafters above, faint but clear, Matthias's chant drifted down, though he was nowhere to be seen. Kraus returned to the schoolhouse that night, dread coiled tight in his chest. He found Bauer asleep at his desk, head resting on pages filled with curling symbols. Matthias lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The boy did not look at Kraus, but his voice, soft as falling snow, filled the room. "You cannot leave. You belong to me now." The days that followed blurred into one long twilight. The sun rose, yet the valley seemed dim, as though Matthias's presence had dulled the light itself. Kraus wandered the schoolhouse like a prisoner in his own mind, clinging to rationality with bleeding fingers. Bauer, by contrast, flourished, if flourishing could be called the fever of a zealot. His cheeks hollowed, his eyes blazed, and his notebooks swelled with endless script. He no longer wrote in German or Latin, but entirely in Matthias's tongue, his hand moving with unnatural certainty. Kraus tried to stop him once, to tear the quills and ink away. Bauer struck him across the face, a wild gleam in his eye. "You are blind," he hissed. "He is giving us back what was stolen. The first speech, the marrow of creation. Every word we speak in our shallow tongues is but a shadow of this, and he remembers it all." Kraus stumbled back, horrified not by the blow, but by the conviction in Bauer's voice. At night, Kraus lay awake listening. Matthias whispered ceaselessly in sleep, phrases that slithered through the dark and coiled around his thoughts. Sometimes he caught fragments, not in meaning but in sensation. The taste of copper on his tongue, the image of fire spilling across stone altars, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down from the ceiling beams. And sometimes, worst of all, he felt his own lips moving unconsciously, echoing the boy's words in the dark. The contagion spread beyond the schoolhouse. Villagers carved symbols into their doorframes, claiming it would protect them, though none knew why. Children formed circles in the snow, chanting softly in Matthias's cadence, their parents too afraid to silence them. A shepherd returned from the high slopes, raving that he had heard voices carried on the wind, not one, but hundreds, all chanting in unison with the boy. He cut his tongue with a knife to silence it. Myself. But even as he bled, his lips moved with the language. Kraus tried to write a letter for help, scratching desperately with frozen fingers. But every time he began, his hand betrayed him, curling into symbols he did not know he knew. He ripped the parchment to shreds, trembling. Escape no longer seemed possible. The language was inside him, inside them all, growing like roots beneath the soil. And in Matthias's eyes, calm, unblinking, ancient, Kraus saw the terrible truth. The boy was not learning from them. He was teaching them piece by piece until the valley itself became his voice. Kraus could no longer sleep. Each time his eyes closed, he was dragged into visions not his own. Ritual fires in cavernous halls, oceans thrashing under blackened skies, towers carved like the breath of the mountains themselves. One afternoon, Kraus wandered into the chapel seeking refuge. The crucifix that once hung above the altar lay shattered on the floor. In its place, someone, perhaps unknowingly, had carved Matthias's symbols into the wood, spirals and hooks that seemed to shift when stared at too long. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. Even sacred walls no longer belonged to God. That night, as the storm howled beyond the shutters, Matthias spoke a phrase unlike the others. It was not a chant, nor a lullaby, but something heavier, deliberate. The floorboards groaned, the air quivered, and Bauer fell prostrate, sobbing with awe. Kraus did not understand the words, yet he felt the meaning ripple through him. The time draws near. In that moment, Kraus realized the valley was not merely cursed, it was chosen. Matthias was not content to haunt them. He was preparing them, shaping them into a chorus, ready to speak with him when the final word was uttered. The first change came quietly, almost unnoticed. An old woman, Frau Engel, who had not left her cottage in weeks, was found wandering the frozen fields barefoot, eyes glazed with a silver sheen. Her lips moved constantly, spilling Matthias's words like a broken fountain. When we all will. His hands shook as he wrote, ink smearing, but his eyes gleamed with feverish devotion. That night, Kraus sat by Matthias's bedside, staring at the child's still form. He looked so small, so fragile, his breath thin in the candlelight. Yet the shadows clung to him, bending toward his body as though the darkness itself sought to cradle him. When his eyes opened suddenly, Kraus flinched back. They were no longer the eyes of a boy, but vast black wells that reflected nothing. Matthias whispered a single phrase, and Kraus felt his own bones tremble in response. He clutched his chest, certain that his heart had skipped. Outside, the church bell began to toll by itself, though no hand touched the rope. Its hollow clang rang through the valley, mingling with distant voices, Frau Engel's chant, still drifting from the forest. The villagers huddled in their beds, ears stuffed with cloth, but the sound seeped through, wrapping around their dreams. By dawn, more had changed. Animals lay dead in the fields, their bodies twisted, mouths open in silent mimicry of human words. The snow itself bore symbols etched by no hand, curling patterns that stretched for miles across the valley floor. And Kraus, staring at them from the schoolhouse window, understood at last. Matthias was not simply teaching them a language, he was reshaping the world itself, one word at a time. Kraus could endure no longer. His hands shook as he packed what little he owned, ink-stained notes, a loaf of stale bread, his father's pocket watch. He waited until Matthias slept. Bauer curled at the boy's feet like a dog, then slipped into the night. Snow crunched beneath his boots, each step a prayer. He told himself if he could reach the mountain pass, perhaps he could find a bishop, a regiment, anyone untouched by the infection. The valley, he thought, could still be sealed. The path up the slopes was treacherous, the wind clawing at his cloak, but desperation lent him strength. For hours he climbed, heart hammering, until the village lights dwindled to faint sparks below. At last the ridge loomed before him, a jagged gateway to freedom. He staggered toward it, nearly sobbing. But then, from the darkness ahead, came a sound that froze his marrow. Voices, dozens of them, chanting. Kraus fell to his knees, the breath ripped from his lungs. Figures emerged through the snow. Travelers, soldiers, merchants perhaps. But their faces were wrong. Their mouths moved in unison, spilling Matthias's tongue into the storm. Some carried rosaries, others swords, yet all swayed with the same rhythm, their eyes glazed silver like Frau Engel's. They had come not from the valley, but from beyond it. The realization struck him like a blow. The language had already spread, perhaps through dreams, perhaps through whispers carried on the wind. It did not need Matthias's presence to travel. It lived now in every soul that had heard even a fragment. The valley was not a prison, it was a seed. Kraus stumbled backward, slipping in the snow. The chanting figures did not advance nor attack. They only stood, forming a wall of sound, voices rising until the mountains themselves seemed to vibrate. Kraus clapped his hands over his ears, but the words pressed inside his skull, blooming like a fire. He screamed, but his scream joined the chant, reshaped into syllables not his own. Somehow he tore himself free, staggering down the slope, back toward the cursed village. His dream of escape had crumbled into dust. There was no outside world untouched by Matthias. There was only the slow, relentless unraveling of reality, one word at a time. When Kraus collapsed at the schoolhouse door, Bauer dragged him inside, eyes bright with triumph. Oceans boiling, towers of black stone piercing clouds, and figures, colossal, faceless, rising to answer Matthias's call. When the chant ended, silence crashed down heavy. Bauer wept openly, whispering prayers of devotion. Matthias turned his head slowly toward Kraus, his lips curling in something that might have been a smile or a warning. "You ask why?" Bauer whispered, his voice shaking with awe. "Because the world we know was never meant to last, and he is undoing the lie of time." Kraus could not endure another word, another vision. His mind teetered at the edge of madness, his body trembling with fever and dread. That night, when Bauer collapsed into exhausted sleep at his desk, Kraus rose, staggering toward the cot where Matthias lay. The boy's eyes were closed, his lips still murmuring faint syllables, each one vibrating in Kraus's skull like the toll of a bell. His hand closed around the poker from the hearth. Its iron head glowed faintly red, trembling with heat. He raised it high, teeth clenched, sweat streaming down his brow. "Forgive me," he whispered, not sure to whom, God, the boy, or the world itself. "I must end this." The poker came down with a hiss. But before it struck, Matthias's eyes He has chosen you, Herr Kraus. Do you not see? You are blessed. You will carry the word as I do, as we all shall." But Kraus wept bitterly, knowing the truth. It was not a blessing, it was a binding. Matthias had spared him not out of mercy, but to make him part of the chorus. His attempt at resistance had not ended the nightmare. He had become its instrument. And in the silence that followed, he heard it clearly for the first time. Matthias's voice inside his head, echoing like a second heartbeat. The days that followed blurred like fever dreams. Kraus no longer trusted the boundaries of his own mind. At first, Matthias's voice was a whisper, faint, like a memory of a lullaby. But soon it grew clearer, sharper, threading through his thoughts until Kraus could no longer tell which words were his and which belonged to the boy. When he tried to pray, the voice mocked him, reshaping his pleas into syllables of the forbidden tongue. When he tried to write, his hand betrayed him, scrawling symbols that pulsed on the page like living things. The villagers had noticed too. They no longer met his eyes. Mothers pulled their children away when he passed. Once, a group of men confronted him in the square, shouting accusations of betrayal, of serving the boy's will. Kraus opened his mouth to deny them, but Matthias's voice spilled forth instead, a single phrase that sent the men fleeing in terror, hands pressed over their bleeding ears. Kraus fell to his knees, retching. But inside, he heard Matthias laughing, soft, childlike, and cruel. Sleep brought no refuge. Dreams dragged him through endless corridors carved with spirals, where faceless giants whispered in harmony. He saw their mouths, vast and lipless, moving with Matthias's words. He felt himself walking toward them, eager, though terror gnawed his gut. Each morning he woke weaker, thinner, his reflection in the wash basin unrecognizable, eyes sunken, skin stretched taut, a man hollowed out. Bauer, however, thrived. His cheeks glowed, his voice strong as he preached openly in the village square, teaching Matthias's language to anyone who dared listen. And some did listen, farmers, children, the butcher's widow. Their voices joined Bauer's, fumbling at first, then growing steady until chants echoed between the houses. The infection was no longer hidden. It was a congregation. One night, Kraus found himself outside, without remembering how he had left his bed. His bare feet bled in the snow, yet he felt no pain. Around him, a dozen villagers knelt in a circle, their faces blank, eyes silver in the moonlight. Matthias stood at the center, small hands raised, his voice weaving through them like a conductor guiding a choir. And Kraus understood with horror. It was not Matthias's voice inside his head. It was his. He was speaking now without opening his mouth, his own thoughts spilling into the chant, feeding it, amplifying it. He had become not merely a victim, but a vessel. The boy turned then, meeting Kraus's gaze with that black, endless stare. And in the chorus of voices, Kraus heard his own thought reflected back at him, twisted into prophecy. "You belong to me now, and through you, the world shall remember." The valley convulsed as though some vast heartbeat beneath its soil. Tremors shook the cottages, rattling shutters from hinges, toppling crucifixes from walls. In the night sky, the stars dimmed one by one, swallowed by a haze that glowed faintly with shifting patterns, spirals, glyphs, the very symbols Kraus had seen carved in blood and ink. Villagers gathered in the square, not out of choice, but compulsion, their bodies moving as if tugged by invisible strings. At the center stood Matthias, arms raised, his small frame trembling yet unbroken. chanting louder. Bauer screamed in ecstasy, tearing open his chest with his nails, offering blood as if it were incense. Kraus's mind shattered at the sight. His voice wailed in the chant, yet inside he screamed wordless defiance. He thought of the boy he had found months ago, small and weak in the woods. How had that frail child become the mouthpiece of Apocalypse? But even as the thought formed, Matthias's gaze found him across the sea of kneeling bodies. The boy's lips curved in a smile, both tender and merciless. The fissure widened. The ground shook as though something pressed upward, yearning to step once more into the world. The air reeked of iron and ash, and as Kraus collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing with words he did not know, a single truth seared itself into his mind. This was not the end of the world. This was its unveiling. The fissure yawned wider, a black wound tearing through the heart of the village. From its depths rose shapes that defied reason, vast, shifting, their forms half hidden in smoke and shadow. At times they seemed like towers of flesh, at others like endless coils of stone come alive, their surfaces etched with the same spirals Matthias had spoken into the world. Every movement sent tremors through the valley, every breath carried a stench of earth turned to rot. The villagers did not flee. They knelt as one, foreheads pressed to the frozen ground, their voices weaving the ancient tongue in feverish devotion. Bauer led them, his chest a bloody ruin, his voice louder than all the rest. Matthias stood at the fissure's edge, small and fragile yet radiant with authority, his words rising in a cadence that stitched the people's chant into a single perfect chorus. Kraus staggered forward, body convulsing as the words tore from him without consent. He tried to resist, to silence himself, but his throat burned, forcing syllables into the air. His eyes blurred with tears, but through them he saw Matthias glance back, and for a heartbeat the boy's face softened, not as prophet or vessel, but as a child once lost in the woods. Then the blackness in his gaze deepened, and the softness was gone. The earth shuddered violently. One of the masters lifted its form fully into the night, a colossal silhouette, faceless, crowned with spirals of burning light. Its voice was a thunder that cracked stone and bent trees, yet every villager echoed it perfectly, their bodies vibrating with borrowed resonance. Kraus felt his ribs ache, as if they would split, his heart pounding not to its own rhythm, but to that of the chant. "Why me?" he cried inwardly, though no sound left his lips but the endless chorus, and the answer came, not from Matthias, not from Bauer, but from the voice within his ski. "Because you listened. Because you remembered." Kraus collapsed at the fissure's edge, hands clawing the frozen ground. His reflection shimmered in the dark abyss below, not of a man, but of a mouth, endless and open, singing. He understood then. His resistance had never mattered. He had been chosen the moment he heard Matthias speak in the woods. He was never the schoolmaster. He was the echo. The master's shadow fell across the valley, blotting out the last remnants of starlight. The chant thundered higher, shaking the heavens themselves, and as the first of the forgotten stepped fully into the world, Kraus's final thought was swallowed whole. The lie of time is undone. The song is eternal. The valley disappeared into silence. Only the language remained,